On a quiet patrol night, Officer Mark thought he was heading home until a tiny puppy blocked his path, barking and tugging him into the darkness. What began as a strange chase turned into a desperate fight for life when he discovered the puppy's mother trapped and dying under barbed wire. You won't believe how this little pup saved his family. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more incredible true stories. The town had already folded itself into evening storefronts, yawning shut, and porch bulbs coming alive one by one like small promises against the dark. Officer Mark Hale eased his cruiser along Maple Street with that end-of-shift ache in his knees, the kind that reminded him of rucksacks and gravel roads from a life he rarely spoke about. He was 51 now, a steady pair of hands in a county that still waved to its deputies and sent pies to the station on holidays. The radio hissed with nothing urgent, just a weather update and a lost cow call he'd handled an hour earlier by coaxing the old Holstein through a gate. He parked under the sycamore near the ball field, killed the engine, and let the quiet settle. Somewhere beyond the outfield fence, a train horn stitched the dusk. He checked his watch, checked the empty sidewalk, and thought about the pot of coffee he'd left on at home, the kind that tasted a little burned but felt like company. That was when he heard a sound no bigger than a breath. Not the scraping of a raccoon lid or the crack of a branch, more like a question asked in the smallest voice. Mark angled his head the way you do when you're listening for something you can't quite name. The sound came again. He stepped out the door, thudding shut with a familiar weight, and scanned the dimness between the bleachers and the chain link. A shape emerged at the edge of the grass. A puppy little more than a handful of shadows stitched together, ears too big for its head coat, dusty like it had rolled through a summer driveway. It paused when it saw him, then came forward in a bobbing, determined line, as if its tiny legs had memorized his outline from far away. "Hey there, bud," Mark said softly, keeping his hands low, palms open. The pup stopped a foot from his boots and tilted its head. He could see the shine of its eyes catch the park light and hold it. Close up, he noticed burrs clinging to its fur and a tremble running along its ribs. It looked like trouble had been chewing on it for days. He crouched, knees complaining, and reached into the pocket of his cargo pants for the emergency packet of turkey jerky he kept for long nights. "You hungry?" he asked, tearing a strip. "Bet you are." He offered the meat. The smell lifted into the cooling air. The pup leaned forward to sniff, then did something that unsettled him more than a growl would have it refused. It turned its head from the food, bumped the back of his knuckles with a wet nose, then lowered itself and went for his bootlace. Its teeth closed gently, not to hurt but to hold, and it tugged. Not once, not a playful nip, but a steady pull followed by a step backward, then a look up that said, plainly, "Come." Mark blinked. "You don't want food." The pup tugged again, paws scooting in the grass for leverage. A soft sound whirring in its throat like a tiny engine. He tried another strip of jerky. The pup ignored it, shifted to the other lace, and pulled with the same small insistence. He felt something stir in his chest, the old instinct that had gotten him through nights overseas when a local kid would knock on the Humvee door and point without words because words weren't fast enough. He glanced toward the cruiser. The radio would expect him to log off soon. He looked back at the pup. "All right, show me." The pup released his lace, stepped backward, and gave out a bark so small it seemed to apologize for its size. Then it trotted toward the far end of the lot, stopped after a few paces, and looked over its shoulder. Mark stood, bones clicking, and followed 3 steps to see if this was a coincidence. The pup moved again, 3 more paces. Another check. Not wandering. Leading. He reached for his flashlight and swept a pale bar across the asphalt and into the grass. Nothing but wrappers. A forgotten glove, chalk lines ghosting the base paths. The pup kept the distance between them measured, not fearful, not clingy. Focused. Halfway across the lot, Mark hesitated. He wasn't off duty yet. Procedure said call animal control, maybe coax the dog into the back seat and deliver it to the shelter. He whistled softly and patted his thigh, the universal invitation. The pup did not come. It circled once, then trotted back, not to climb into his arms or his car, but to plant its front paws against the driver's door and scratch claws ticking like a hurried metronome. When he stepped toward the handle, it dropped down and stood directly in front of the door, blocking it. It wasn't asking for a ride. It was making sure he wouldn't drive away. "You're not letting me leave, are you?" Mark said, half a smile touching his mouth despite the unease prickling his neck. The pup answered with that same small bark and darted back the way it had been guiding him. He tried the jerky once more. No luck. He tried the back door of the cruiser. Immediate protest, the puppy wedged itself between his shins and the open door, tiny frame vibrating with urgency. He had seen beggars, runaways, strays of every kind. This was different. This was intention. "All right," he said, voice low. "You win." He locked the cruiser, clicked the flashlight to a narrower beam, and fell in behind the pup. They crossed the chalked diamond and the sleeping bleachers. Dry leaves rattled underfoot like quiet applause. Over the fence, he could just make out the service lane that ran behind the equipment sheds, a strip of ground maintenance crews used and kids avoided because it dead-ended at a tangle of storm-thrown limbs from last spring's weather. The pup aimed for it with no hesitation. Mark followed, careful with his steps. He kept talking in the steady way that calmed people at traffic stops and hearts in ambulances. "Name's Mark," he murmured. "You've got opinions, I'll give you that." The pup glanced back as if to check he was still there, then pressed on. Up close, the service lane smelled of cut grass and oil. A soda can winked from the dirt. Mark's light found the scuffed edge of a fence post and a smear of sap where bark had been shaved off by something hitting hard. He filed it away without comment. He wasn't ready to make anything of it yet. The pup paused at the lip of the lane and lifted a paw, setting it carefully avoiding a patch of stickers without even looking. Smart, he thought. Not lucky, aware. He felt that internal click that had guided him through years of assessments. You don't argue with evidence. You read it. They reached the back of the sheds where the groundskeeper stored chalk and hoses. A motion sensor flickered, then held pouring harsh white over dull aluminum. Bugs danced in the sudden stage light. The pup didn't flinch. It trotted to the darker margin where the beam couldn't reach and weighted tail held low but steady, not wagging for approval, not cowering. Waiting for him to arrive as if that was part of the job it had assigned itself. Mark drew closer. The night had turned fully now, a blue so deep it felt like water. Somewhere, someone laughed on a porch. A dog 2 streets over answered with a routine bark, nothing like the thin, purposeful sound at his feet. He knelt again to put the back of his hand near the pup's nose. The air coming from it was warm, quick, and even, not the pant of fear, but the pace of a runner who knows exactly how far is left. "Okay," he said. "You've got me." He tried to scoop the pup to check for tags. It danced just out of reach and pressed its head against his shin before turning toward the end of the lane. A breeze moved through the sycamores and brought with it a smell he couldn't quite place earth, yes, and something metallic under it the way rain smells when it first hits hot pavement. He stood. He would radio in soon, but not yet. The choice settled over him not as a grand decision, but as a simple one, the way a door opens because a hand turns the knob. He looked back once at his cruiser, the familiar shape that meant safety and report forms and endings. The pup, as if sensing the tug, hustled back, planted both paws on his boot, and held his gaze with a steadiness that belonged on a face much older. It wasn't pleading. It was appointing him to a task. He nodded to a puppy that could not nod back and let himself be led. Every few yards, new details appeared that he told himself he'd sort later, a scrap of blue thread snagged on wire, a shallow slide in the dirt where something had dragged a bottle cap, hammered flat by traffic. The world had gone quiet enough that he could hear the quick shiver of the pup's tags. No, not tags. Just a tiny metal ring on an empty collar ticking time as they moved. Mark kept his breath slow and his steps sure. He felt the old ache in his knees and thought not for the first time that some burdens arrive small and grow only if you don't heed them. He would heed this one. He would see where it pointed, and if it led nowhere, he would apologize to the night and carry the pup to the shelter where warm light and stainless steel bowls waited. But he didn't think that's how this would go. The puppy would not have refused food, would not have blocked a door, would not be drawing a straight line through a place with nothing to offer except an answer. He lengthened his stride. The pup kept pace, a speck of resolve stitched to the edge of his beam. Somewhere up ahead, beyond what he could yet see, the evening was holding its breath. Mark kept following the pup along the narrow service lane, his boots crunching against gravel, his flashlight beam swinging across weeds and rusting equipment. For a moment he hesitated, calculating the balance between duty and instinct, telling himself he had already gone further than protocol suggested, and maybe it was time to call it in and let animal control handle the stray. He slowed, half-turning back toward the cruiser glinting faintly through the trees. The pup noticed at once. Its small body whipped around, and before Mark could take another step, it darted in front of his boots, circling tightly, barking with surprising volume for a creature so small. The bark wasn't panicked. It was deliberate, like a guard sounding an alarm. Mark tried to step around it, but the pup moved again, planting itself directly in his path. Eyes fixed upward, chest trembling with urgency. He paused, studying it, then reached down with an open palm to reassure, but the pup only gave a sharp yelp and began running circles, kicking up dust that shimmered in the beam of his flashlight. It wasn't begging for food or comfort. It was commanding him not to leave. Mark exhaled a slow breath, curling into the cool night, and whispered, "All right, I hear you." He adjusted his duty belt and let the pup lead again, though doubt lingered at the edges of his mind. The path narrowed further, hemmed in by tall weeds and the faint smell of oil leaking from old maintenance machines. The pup moved ahead with certainty, weaving through the dark as if it had memorized every dip and rise. When the lane reached a fork, Mark expected the little one to veer toward the familiar glow of town lights, but instead it darted sharply to the right toward a stretch of ground that was rougher, quieter, and led away from any houses. The beam of his flashlight caught the faint track of worn dirt where tires once rolled but hadn't in months. Mark frowned, his instincts telling him this wasn't a casual detour. He tested the air. It carried a stillness that pressed against the skin, a stillness broken only by the rapid rhythm of tiny paws ahead of him. The puppy didn't falter. Its head stayed low, tail, stiff body quivering with direction. Mark followed carefully, his boots finding uneven ground each step loud in the hush of the night. His radio crackled faintly at his side, but he ignored it, unwilling to shatter the strange thread pulling him forward. As the service road stretched deeper, shadows lengthened into shapes that played tricks on his eyes. The pup stopped once, halfway down the lane, turned to face him, and barked twice, short, decisive bursts before racing ahead again. Mark recognized it as confirmation this wasn't random wandering. The pup knew exactly where it was going. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and pressed onward. The road dipped slightly, revealing the skeletal outlines of storage sheds long abandoned, their padlocks rusted and doors sagging inward. The pup skirted them without pause, nose close to the ground, movements sharp and decisive. Mark noted every detail: broken glass glinting under the beam, a bent traffic cone half buried in weeds, the outline of a fence further on where the lane disappeared into darker woods. Twice more Mark tried to test the pup, slowing deliberately as if to turn back. Each time the little creature darted to intercept him, barking, circling, refusing to allow retreat. By the third time, Mark stopped pretending. He admitted silently that he was committed. The lane grew narrower, still hemmed in by tangles of thorny brush. Mark lifted his arm to shield his face, the beam of the flashlight swinging wildly across branches that clawed at his uniform. The pup seemed undeterred, leaping through gaps just wide enough to fit its small body, then waiting for him. Ears perked, eyes bright despite the dark. Mark pressed forward, sweat beginning to bead along his brow despite the cool air. At the far end of the service road where the lights of town were long gone and the hum of traffic no longer reached, the pup paused again. It stood still, chest heaving, then let out one long, low bark that echoed off the silent sheds. Mark's pulse quickened. Something lay ahead. Something the pup refused to face alone. He shifted his flashlight forward, but the beam dissolved into thickets and shadow. His boots scuffed against the gravel as he moved closer. The pup darting ahead, then back again as though tugging him onward. Every sign pointed to purpose. This was no lost stray searching for scraps. This was a guide, a sentinel pulling him towards something hidden, something urgent. Mark swallowed the dryness in his throat, tightened the strap of his flashlight, and stepped fully into the lane the pup had chosen. The air cooled the scent of damp earth rising. He felt the prickle of gooseflesh climb his arms. Whatever waited beyond would not be small. The pup ran on sure-footed, each bark bouncing off the hollow night. Mark followed, knowing now, without question, that this was not a chase he could abandon. The service road thinned into a strip of dirt where weeds grew high enough to brush against Mark's knees. The air hung heavier here, quiet enough that each crunch of his boots echoed like a statement made to the night. The pup's energy shifted. Its earlier urgency became something sharper, more focused, as if it knew they were nearing the place where answers lived. It slowed nose low to the ground, sniffing in short bursts, then froze at the edge of a chain-link fence bent awkwardly inward. The beam of Mark's flashlight found the fence post, then slid downward to where a torn piece of fabric clung like a flag left behind. He knelt examining it, his hand steady, though his pulse was not. The cloth was dark blue, thin cotton snagged and shredded along the metal wire. He touched the edge gently, noticing how the fibers frayed in more than one direction, as if someone had struggled here. His jaw tightened. This was no accident of weather or time. Something or someone had pulled hard enough to tear free. The pup barked once, a short sound that pulled his attention back down. It pawed at the dirt near the fence tail's stiff body, rigid with insistence. Mark lowered the flashlight beam and saw the ground scuffed raw patches of soil torn open by claws and small paws. He shifted the beam wider and found the story written there, the unmistakable scatter of small prints, some fresh, some layered, mingling with deeper furrows where nails had raked furiously at the earth. It looked like desperation made physical. He squatted lower, tracing the outline with his eyes piecing together the movements. A pup had stood here, perhaps more than one, clawing at the ground, circling, returning again and again, as if trying to dig someone free. The soil was uneven ridges broken by frantic effort. The realization pressed heavy on him. This was not play. It was survival. Mark drew a slow breath and glanced back toward the lights of town, faint now, almost swallowed by distance. He thought of the comfort of rules and procedures, the safe routine of writing reports and filing evidence. But the fabric, the tracks, the frantic scratches, none of it fit the box of routine. He reached for his radio thumb hovering above the transmit button, then lowered it. He couldn't yet explain what he had. And more than that, the pup was still moving, still guiding, still demanding he see more. The little dog nosed at the fence again, slipped sideways to an opening where the metal sagged low and wriggled through with a small grunt. Mark followed, pushing the chain link aside, the metal scraping against his jacket sleeve. On the other side, the air was cooler, damper, filled with the smell of leaves long fallen and earth long undisturbed. The pup paused to make sure he came, then bounded a few feet forward, turning back ears, forward, eyes reflecting the beam. Mark swept his light across the ground and saw more signs. Grass bent flat, not by wind, but by weight. A drag mark, subtle but undeniable, stretched from the fence deeper into the thicket. He followed it with his eyes, then with his boots, every step sinking slightly into the damp soil. His breath grew louder in his ears, mingling with the steady thump of his pulse. The pup moved ahead, but never too far, always circling back as though to remind him of direction. At one point, Mark crouched again to study a clearer print in the mud. It was small oval edges sharp where the claws had pressed deep. He compared it silently to the prints circling his own boots, and confirmed what he already knew. These were canine, matching the pup's, but larger, heavier, belonging to something older, perhaps the mother. The drag marks beside them told a harder truth that the older dog hadn't walked away freely. It had been pulled or had collapsed and been dragged by some force greater than its failing strength. Mark felt the prickle of unease settle deeper along his spine. He rose slowly, eyes narrowing into the dark ahead. This was the threshold, the crossing point between curiosity and consequence. He could still turn back, still call it in, and hand over the puzzle to others. But the pup stood waiting, body vibrating with urgency, tail flicking in sharp jerks. It would not let him retreat, and he knew himself well enough to recognize that he couldn't either. He pressed onward, flashlight steady scanning for every detail. The trail twisted through a patch of brush where branches caught at his sleeves. He ducked low, listening to the faint rustle of the pup slipping through ahead. The air changed as he entered, cooler still, touched with a metallic tang that tightened his throat. He kept moving, senses sharpened, aware that the world behind him was ordinary, while the world ahead promised only escalation. The pup barked once more, sharp against the quiet, then pawed at another scuffed patch of dirt. Mark knelt to see deeper scratches here, longer and more jagged than before, as though something larger had fought to rise but failed. The ground bore the record of struggle, the kind that ended not in freedom, but in exhaustion. He traced one furrow with his glove, imagining claws scraping desperately, and he swallowed hard. He stood again, the weight of understanding heavy in his chest. This was more than a lost animal. It was a fight for survival written in dirt and fabric, and he was reading the lines like a man deciphering a message meant for him alone. The pup stood silent now, ears pricked, gaze fixed forward, as if knowing the next step would reveal what words could not. Mark adjusted his grip on the flashlight and steadied his breath. The threshold was behind him now, the trail of signs undeniable, the pull of the pup unrelenting. He lifted his eyes into the darkness where the drag marks disappeared and felt the certainty settle. Something waited there. Something hurt. Something in need. He moved forward without another glance back. The drag marks and scratches led Mark deeper past the bent fence until the ground softened under his boots and the tall weeds gave way to the first row of trees. The air cooled noticeably, and with each step the hum of distant town life faded until all that remained was the quiet chorus of the forest itself. His flashlight beam cut across trunks that rose like silent pillars, their bark pale against the shadows. The pup darted ahead, nose low, tail stiff, and Mark quickened his stride to keep it in sight. The sense of crossing into another world was strong enough that he adjusted his breathing as though preparing for an encounter. He told himself he was only investigating tracks, only following a lead until he could confirm or deny it, but he knew better. His instincts whispered that the deeper he went, the closer he came to something that mattered more than he wanted to admit. A sudden crack in the undergrowth snapped his attention to the left. He halted, flashlight sweeping hand hovering near his radio. The sound was heavy enough to mimic a deer or a raccoon, and he braced for a startled rush of fur through the brush. The noise came again, a shuffle mixed with a faint whine, and his pulse quickened. He swung the beam sharply, expecting eyes to glow back at him, but the light fell only on the pup, crouched low, wriggling through a gap between two bushes. He exhaled, half a laugh of relief caught in his throat. The sound he had thought was wildlife had been the small body forcing its way through undergrowth, moving with a determination that made the false alarm worth the jolt. He followed, ducking low, the branches tugging at his sleeves until he emerged onto a faint trail barely visible under the cover of leaves. It was narrow, half claimed by nature, but it bore the marks of passage, a strip of ground where grass lay flattened, where small stones had been nudged aside. The pup stood waiting, paws pressed against the dirt as though it had been here many times. Mark recognized it immediately as a hidden path, one that locals might overlook, one not marked on any patrol map. The pup had not been wandering. It had retraced a line etched into its memory. He felt the realization deepen the weight of the moment. This wasn't random. This was direction written in the ground. They moved together down the path, the beam catching moths that spiraled briefly in the light before vanishing again. The forest grew denser, the canopy closing above until the moon barely pierced through. Each step carried them further from safety, but Mark no longer entertained the thought of turning back. His focus narrowed to the trail, the pup, and the strange sense of urgency that wrapped around them both. The path eventually widened and split in two directions. To the left, the ground sloped gently upward toward lighter trees. To the right, it dipped into a darker hollow, the air cooler, the soil damp. Mark paused, considering which route to take when the pup made the choice clear. It dashed a few steps toward the left, then abruptly doubled back and planted itself squarely in front of him, paws braced, body blocking the way. It barked sharply once, then turned to face the right path, trotting forward a few feet before glancing back. Mark frowned, testing it by stepping toward the left. The pup rushed again to intercept, barking louder this time, circling his boots as though scolding him for the attempt. When he shifted to the right, the pup calmed instantly, moving ahead with smooth certainty. The logic was plain, undeniable. This wasn't instinctive flailing. This was decision. The little dog had chosen deliberately, guided by memory or by scent, and it refused to allow him to take the wrong turn. Mark followed into the hollow, the air thick with dampness, the ground soft underfoot. The forest here carried a different silence, not peaceful but tense, as if waiting. He kept the flashlight steady, scanning every angle, noting broken twigs and fresh scuffs where something had passed recently. The pup pressed on, confident, pausing only when he lagged, never allowing more than a few yards of distance. Each twist of the path revealed more signs. A branch snapped at shoulder height, the faint impression of weight dragged through leaves, a tuft of fur caught in thorns. Mark felt the story unfolding with each step, every clue another piece of confirmation that they were on the right trail. The pup's behavior convinced him more than any evidence. It knew this road, knew the direction, and would not allow him to falter. By the time the hollow began to narrow, his shoulders were tight with expectation. He adjusted his grip on the flashlight, feeling the rough metal under his palm, and braced himself for what lay further ahead. The threshold had been crossed. Now the forest itself seemed to funnel him toward discovery. The pup moved with a steadiness that suggested the destination was close. Mark's heart pressed faster, his breath slower, every sense tuned to the unfolding mystery. The hollow tightened into a corridor of trees, their branches bending overhead like ribs of some great body. And Mark pressed on with careful steps, the pup leading but never straying too far. The trail was clearer now, broken twigs and flattened leaves sketching the path of something that had been dragged or had fought to stay upright. Mark kept his flashlight steady, each sweep of the beam revealing fragments of story written in the earth. His mind catalogued each sign scrapes in the soil, paw prints overlapping a tuft of fur snagged on bramble, while his chest tightened with the certainty that they were close to something significant. The path bent sharply, and as he rounded the curve, his light caught on the shape of a wooden crate, half buried in weeds, overturned, as if abandoned in haste. He slowed instincts, sharpening, and approached with deliberate care. The crate was weathered but not ancient. Its slats were scarred with deep grooves where sharp teeth had gnawed and pulled. He crouched beside it, running his gloved fingers along the edges. The marks were fresh, the wood splintered and raw, and his mind conjured the image of a dog fighting to break free. The idea sent a chill crawling up his spine. This wasn't discarded junk. It was a trap that had held something alive, something desperate. The pup barked once, circling the crate nose pressed close to the ground. It pawed at the dirt, whining low, then shoved its nose into a small hollow at the corner. Mark steadied his light on the spot and saw the soil loosen as the pup scratched furiously. He reached to still it, but before his hand touched fur, the pup nosed something out, a crumpled food wrapper smeared with grease and dirt. Mark picked it up carefully, the crinkle loud in the quiet. The brand was cheap, the kind sold at any corner store, but it told him what he needed to know: someone had lured animals here with food, then left them behind. The wrapper smelled faintly of old meat and something sour. He dropped it into a small evidence bag clipped to his belt and rose slowly, surveying the area. The overturned crate, the gnaw marks, the discarded lure, all of it combined into a story he couldn't ignore. The pup hadn't been wandering aimlessly. It had been leading him to proof, to a scene of survival carved into the forest itself. He stepped back, flashlight sweeping wider. Behind the crate, more signs emerged, claw marks etched into the dirt. A shallow groove where weight had shifted again and again, perhaps from pacing or from struggle. He imagined a mother dog pressed inside the crate, her pup outside scratching at the wood, both trapped in a nightmare of hunger and fear. His chest tightened as he realized how close they might have come to never escaping. The pup whined again, pulling his attention toward a cluster of weeds nearby. It dug there with frantic energy, scattering soil until something small and metallic glinted in the beam. Mark knelt, brushing aside the dirt, and uncovered the rusted hinge of a latch. The crate had been locked. He stared at it for a long moment, the truth sinking deeper. This wasn't an accident. It was intentional confinement. Someone had put the dogs here and left them to starve. The discovery pressed heavily on him, and he felt the weight of responsibility settle deeper on his shoulders. He stood, the forest pressing close around him, every shadow heavy with unspoken questions. Who had done this? How long had the animals suffered? How many had not survived? He looked down at the pup, which sat now at his boots, chest heaving, eyes fixed on him with a mixture of hope and command. It had brought him here for a reason, and he understood this was only the beginning. He adjusted his flashlight, sweeping further along the trail. More disturbances in the soil pointed forward, a line of broken brush and faint drag marks stretching deeper into the trees. The crate was the first discovery, the first undeniable sign of deliberate harm, but the story was not finished here. The pup rose, trotting ahead again, pausing at the edge of the beam to wait for him. Its loyalty and urgency burned through its small frame, and Mark knew he couldn't stop. He cast one last glance at the overturned crate, its splintered slats shining pale in the light, then followed the pup deeper into the forest. The night had grown colder, the air carrying a dampness that clung to his skin, but his resolve only hardened. The evidence was clear, the trail undeniable, and the mission now his. Mark pressed onward, leaving behind the overturned crate and the rusted latch that had spoken volumes. The pup trotted ahead, each movement charged with urgency, nose to the ground, tail stiff like an arrow pointing to destiny. The trail grew harsher, the soil muddied with drag marks and scattered leaves that told of something forced through unwilling terrain. Mark's beam caught glints of disturbed earth and occasional tufts of fur, and his pulse climbed as the story grew clearer. Something had fought here. Something had suffered. He followed without hesitation, now drawn by a mixture of duty and the unshakable pull of the pup's determination. The air changed again, denser and heavier, with a metallic edge that made his throat tighten. The pup slowed suddenly, ears erect, body rigid. A faint rustle drifted through the brush ahead. Mark froze, every muscle-attuned hand tightening around the flashlight. He listened, heart thudding in rhythm with the stillness. The sound came again, faint but distinct, not the quick scuttle of a rabbit or the steady shuffle of a deer. It was softer, broken, like a breath that struggled to find its way. He advanced carefully, sweeping the beam ahead, and the pup darted forward with a short yelp. The light landed on a shape pressed low against the ground where the forest ended against a barbed wire fence half collapsed from age. At first it looked like a bundle of earth and leaves, until the faint rise and fall of ribs caught his eye. His breath caught. A German shepherd lay tangled beneath the sagging wire, her body frighteningly thin fur matted and patchy, her frame trembling with the effort of each shallow breath. She did not bark, did not growl. Her eyes lifted slowly, glassy, yet fiercely alive, and locked not on him, but on the small pup that scrambled toward her. The pup yipped frantically, pressing against the wire nose, seeking any opening to reach its mother. The shepherd shifted muscles, straining weakly, and tried to lift her head. Her eyes never left the pup's face, as though his arrival was the only proof she had been waiting for. Mark dropped to one knee, his throat tight, and moved the beam to assess. The wire coiled across her flank and pinned one leg to the ground. Each movement she made cut deeper into her skin, leaving raw patches where fur had been stripped away. The sight pressed a heavy ache into his chest. The pup pawed desperately at the dirt, whining, and the mother answered with the faintest whimper, a sound so fragile it barely reached him. Still, it was not directed at Mark. Every ounce of her failing strength aimed toward her pup. She shifted, dragging herself an inch closer despite the wire cutting across her body, her muzzle stretching weakly toward him. It was not a plea for help from the man kneeling nearby, but an instinctive reach toward her child, as though she could shield him even now. Mark felt his eyes sting as he watched the silent exchange. He had seen bravery on battlefields, had seen men hold their ground through fire and fear, but the sight of this frail body refusing to surrender the act of protection cut him deeper than he expected. He leaned closer, voice low, steady, despite the tremor in his chest. "Easy, girl," he whispered. "I see you. I see what you're doing." His words were for himself as much as for her, an anchor in the face of raw, unfiltered survival. The pup pressed tighter against the wire small paws, scraping at the ground as if by sheer will it could dig her free. The shepherd's eyes flicked to the pup again, glassy but unwavering, then closed briefly in exhaustion before opening once more. Mark could almost feel the message she carried, not for him, but for the life she had fought to protect. He steadied his breathing, forcing focus. The mother was alive, but just barely, and her strength was ebbing fast. She could not free herself. If he didn't act soon, she would lose the fight she had clung to for too long already. He glanced at the pup, which continued to whine and paw, never giving up despite the hopelessness of its effort. That same refusal stirred in Mark's chest, hardening his resolve. He reached forward, testing the tension of the barbed wire. It was tight, biting into the ground and her body. His flashlight beam caught fresh blood staining the rust. She flinched slightly at his touch, but did not break her gaze from her pup. The silent plea was clear. Do not let him be alone. Mark clenched his jaw, nodding once as if answering her without words. The forest around them seemed to hush further, as though aware that this was no ordinary moment. Mark set the flashlight between his knees to free his hands, his mind already calculating how to cut her free. He knew time was slipping, each shallow breath proof of how little margin remained. The pup barked once more, high and insistent, circling back to press against his leg before darting again toward his trapped mother. The urgency in its small body mirrored the urgency in his own. He pressed one hand gently against the shepherd's head, feeling the faint twitch of her ear against his palm. "Hold on," he whispered. "We'll get you out." She closed her eyes briefly, exhaling in what seemed like both relief and surrender. But when she opened them again, her gaze still clung fiercely to her pup. Mark tightened his grip on her unspoken trust. Mark steadied his flashlight against the dirt, its beam casting a pale circle over the shepherd's battered frame. He pressed both hands against the sagging wire, testing its give, but it barely moved. The rusted strands bit deeper into the dog's flank each time he tried to pull them apart. He clenched his jaw, realizing the truth: his strength alone would not free her. The wire was too tight, twisted from years of tension locked in place by its own stubbornness. He glanced at the pup, which scratched furiously at the soil, whimpering, then at the shepherd's glassy eyes that flickered only for her child. The pressure in his chest deepened. He reached for his duty knife clipped to his belt, flipped it open with one steady motion, and positioned the blade carefully against the wire. The metal screeched as the edge pressed in sparks of friction glinting faintly in the beam. Mark bore down his shoulders, straining sweat rising along his brow despite the cool night. The shepherd shuddered but did not fight him. She held still, her breathing shallow, as though understanding that every movement he made was a chance for release. The pup darted forward and sank its small teeth into a lower strand, pulling with frantic energy. Mark froze for a heartbeat, fearing it would cut itself, but the pup would not be deterred. It tugged and growled with its tiny frame, its paws scraping raw against the ground, each whimper threaded with determination. Mark steadied his own movements, angling the blade to slice through the first strand. The wire resisted, groaning under the pressure, then gave with a sharp snap that echoed into the stillness. The shepherd exhaled a weak gasp, her body shifting slightly with the sudden release. The pup barked once, muffled by the wire between its teeth, then yanked harder as if answering his effort with its own. Mark pressed the knife to another section, working faster now, every muscle burning with focus. He could feel the urgency of time pressing against him, each shallow breath from the shepherd reminding him that minutes mattered. As he cut, the pup's claws scraped against stone, leaving thin lines of blood along its pads, but it never paused. Its body trembled with exertion, yet it bit and pulled as though its small frame carried the strength of 10. Mark felt his throat tighten at the sight. This was no helpless animal waiting for rescue. This was a partner refusing to let him fight alone. He worked with renewed force, cutting through another strand, then another, until the wire began to loosen its cruel grip. The shepherd shifted again, her head lifting an inch higher, her eyes flashing briefly toward her pup. Almost there, Mark murmured, voice low and steady, as if the reassurance could weave strength back into her frame. He cut again, the knife edge biting deep, the screech loud in his ears. The wire snapped once more, curling away, and the shepherd's hind leg slipped free. The pup whined, tail wagging once in exhausted triumph before it resumed pulling at another strand. Mark repositioned, careful not to let the blade nick fur or skin, and drove the edge against the final coil binding her side. His arms ached, his hands slick with sweat, but he pushed until the wire groaned and broke. The last strand gave way with a final crack, and the shepherd collapsed forward onto the dirt, freed at last. For a moment she lay still, chest rising in shallow but easier breaths. The pup rushed to her side, pressing against her muzzle, licking frantically, tail beating weakly against the ground. The shepherd's eyes closed, then opened again, and this time they flicked toward Mark. It was not trust yet, not gratitude, but an acknowledgement, a fragile thread of recognition. Mark folded his knife and clipped it back to his belt, then slid his hands gently under the shepherd's frame to lift her slightly clear of the broken wire. She whimpered softly, but her body did not resist. He lowered her carefully onto a patch of grass away from the barbs, then knelt back on his heels, catching his breath. The pup remained pressed against her, its small body quivering, but steadfast as if keeping watch. Mark swept his flashlight over the wounds. The barbs had torn into her side and legs, leaving angry welts and shallow cuts, some oozing with blood, others raw and open. She was emaciated, her ribs sharp beneath thinning fur, but alive. Barely, but alive. He touched his radio, tempted to call for immediate evacuation, but the distance, the time, the fragility of her breaths told him that waiting might mean the end. He would have to carry her himself. Before he moved, he let his hand rest once more against her head. Her ears twitched faintly under his palm, and she exhaled a breath that rattled but carried a note of release. The pup pressed closer, still pawing lightly at her shoulder, as though urging her to rise. She shifted, struggling weakly to lift herself, but her body failed her. She sagged back into the grass, her eyes closing for a heartbeat, before reopening to lock again on her pup. That gaze carried the same message as before. Her strength was gone, but her devotion remained. Mark tightened his jaw and reached for his jacket, sliding it under her frame to form a makeshift stretcher. The pup stepped back reluctantly, watching with wide eyes, then darted forward again to lick her face, unwilling to leave her side even for a moment. Mark steadied his grip, braced his shoulders, and prepared to lift. The rescue was not finished. It had only begun. Mark tightened the sleeves of his jacket beneath the shepherd's frail body and adjusted his grip, lifting her carefully from the grass. Her weight startled him, not because it was heavy, but because it was alarmingly light, the kind of weight that spoke more of absence than of presence, a body thinned by hunger and exhaustion. The pup barked once, circling his boots as if urging him to move quickly, its small body vibrating with determination. Mark steadied his breath, adjusted the balance of her frame against his chest, and reached for his radio with one free hand. Static filled the night before a voice cut through. "Unit Hale. Go ahead." Mark's reply was steady, though his throat tightened. "I've got a critically injured animal adult shepherd location north of the service lane requesting immediate veterinary rescue." The pause that followed seemed to stretch longer than it should. Then the voice returned, clipped but calm. "Copy Unit Hale. Rescue ETA 1 hour, repeat 1 hour." Mark closed his eyes briefly, the weight of those words pressing against him. 1 hour was a lifetime too long. He looked down at the shepherd, her shallow breaths warm but uneven against his arm, and at the pup whose eyes burned with expectation. He pressed the radio back to his belt and spoke under his breath. "We're not waiting." He shifted her carefully and began the trek back through the forest, every step deliberate, every muscle in his arms burning with the effort of keeping her steady. The pup trotted ahead, ears pricked, then darted back to check on him, then forward again, guiding with unwavering certainty. Its barks cut the silence high and sharp, as if calling him to keep pace. The forest pressed around them, the path uneven branches scraping his uniform, but Mark pressed forward with a focus sharpened by urgency. The weight of the shepherd grew heavier with each passing yard, not in pounds but in the toll it took on his endurance. His shoulders ached. His arms trembled and sweat beaded along his temples. The pup barked louder, running a few yards ahead, and then returning its eyes, flashing encouragement. It seemed to know the quickest way, veering around tangles of brush, choosing the smoother ground, clearing the path as if it had walked it countless times. Mark trusted it, adjusting his steps to follow its lead. Halfway back through the hollow, his knees buckled once, forcing him to lower himself to the ground. He laid the shepherd gently against the grass, her body limp but breathing. He pressed his hand against her chest, counting the uneven rise and fall, then glanced at the pup. The little one whined, pawing at his boot, then dashed ahead a few steps before barking sharply, urging him not to stop. Mark's breath came heavy, chest heaving, but he nodded. "All right, buddy," he whispered. "I'm with you." He lifted her again, bracing his legs, and pushed onward. The pup's leadership grew more urgent as the terrain shifted. It darted through a gap in the brush, yipping to draw him toward the clearer route, then barked again when he lagged. Its voice, though small, carried through the forest like a beacon, reminding him with every note that he wasn't carrying this burden alone. Mark focused on the rhythm of his steps, the shallow breaths of the shepherd against his chest, and the guiding cries of the pup ahead. Together they moved as a unit, fragile but determined. As they neared the service road, fatigue weighed heavy, pressing into his muscles like lead. His vision blurred briefly with exertion, and he stumbled once more, knees striking the dirt. The pup barked frantically, circling back, jumping against his leg, its paws leaving streaks of soil across his uniform. Mark steadied himself, pressing the shepherd close, refusing to let her slip. He drew on reserves carved from years of discipline, lifting again with a groan that was half effort, half prayer. The night air cooled further, carrying with it the faint scent of asphalt. They were close to the edge of the forest. The pup seemed to sense it too, sprinting ahead and barking with renewed urgency, its small frame silhouetted in the beam of his flashlight. Mark tightened his grip, adjusted his pace, and followed the sound, every step carrying him closer to open ground. When they finally broke from the trees onto the gravel lane, the relief was sharp enough to steal his breath. He lowered the shepherd briefly onto the ground, kneeling beside her to check the faint rise of her chest. Still alive. Barely, but alive. The pup pressed against her muzzle, whining, then looked up at Mark as if demanding he continue. He wiped sweat from his brow, nodded once, and lifted her again. The road stretched ahead, the faint glint of his cruiser visible in the distance, and he pushed forward, guided by the pup's voice echoing through the night. The gravel road stretched ahead like a thin ribbon under the pale glow of his flashlight, and Mark pushed forward with the shepherd cradled in his arms. Each step jarred his muscles, each breath rasped through his lungs, but he held her close, unwilling to let her slip. The pup bounded at his side, barking in sharp bursts, then darting ahead, circling back again to keep the pace steady. The cruiser glinted faintly in the distance, a silver promise waiting at the edge of the dark. Mark fixed his eyes on it, every ounce of strength bent toward closing the gap. The shepherd's body shifted suddenly against his chest, her frame trembling weakly. Mark glanced down, alarmed, and saw her eyes flutter then close. Her breaths, already shallow, grew ragged, each inhale catching each exhale, faltering. Panic pressed into his throat. "Stay with me," he whispered, his voice low but urgent, the words falling into the night like prayers. He adjusted his hold, lifting her higher, trying to steady the rhythm of her breathing against his own chest. For a moment, her body sagged limp, and his heart lurched, as though she had already slipped away. The pup barked sharply, the sound echoing in the quiet road, then leapt at his leg, scratching for attention. Mark forced himself onward, legs burning, arms screaming, but the weight in his chest was heavier than the dog he carried. He counted her breaths, uneven and frightening, telling himself that as long as they came, however faint, there was still time. The cruiser loomed closer now, its roof glinting faintly under the moonlight. He could see the outline of the rear door, could almost feel the relief of setting her gently inside. But her breathing faltered again, shorter, more jagged, her body twitching faintly, as though fighting to cling to the thread of life. Mark stumbled once, dropping to one knee, cradling her as if she were made of glass. He pressed his ear close to her muzzle, desperate for sound, and caught only the faintest whisper of breath, broken and inconsistent. "No, not yet," he whispered fiercely, clutching her tighter. "You've held on too long to stop now." The pup let out a series of frantic barks, circling his boots, then dashed ahead to the cruiser and back again, as if urging him to hurry. Mark forced himself up his legs, quivering with exhaustion, and staggered the final yards. The cruiser's metallic body shimmered under his beam, the rear door reflecting light like a beacon. He reached it with a grunt, shifting her carefully to one arm, while yanking the handle open with the other. The pup leapt instantly, scrambling into the back seat, before he had even lowered her down. It turned in tight, frantic circles, barking in rapid bursts, then pressed itself against the seat as if carving a space for her. Its eyes burned with demand, its cries sharp and insistent. Mark understood at once. It wasn't merely trying to comfort her. It was commanding him to place her inside where it could remain pressed against her, close enough to lend whatever warmth and strength its small body could offer. He lowered the shepherd carefully onto the seat, adjusting his jacket beneath her frame, then stepped back only long enough to catch his breath. The pup immediately clambered over her, nosing at her muzzle, whining and licking its tail, thrashing with anxious devotion. The shepherd stirred faintly, her chest rising shallow but steady for the moment, her eyes flickering open just enough to meet the pup's gaze. Mark slid into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut with his elbow, the sound reverberating through the silent road. He flicked on the ignition, the engine roaring to life, headlights cutting a desperate line through the night. He glanced into the rearview mirror, watching as the pup curled tightly against the shepherd, still licking her face, still refusing to yield. Her chest rose again, faint but visible, each breath a fragile victory. His knuckles whitened against the steering wheel, and he pressed the accelerator gravel scattering beneath the tires. The siren wailed into the night, a sound of urgency, a sound of hope. The road ahead stretched long and lonely, but Mark felt the weight of purpose sharpen him. He drove with steady focus, eyes flicking between the dark pavement ahead and the mirror where the fight for life continued in the back seat. The shepherd was slipping, but she was not alone. The pup's small body pressed close, its cries unwavering, its loyalty louder than the siren itself. And Mark, jaw set, heart pounding, swore silently to both of them that he would not stop until help was reached. The cruiser tore through the empty county road, its siren cutting the night, wide-open headlights carving fierce lines into the darkness. Mark leaned forward, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles blanched, eyes flicking between the asphalt ahead and the rearview mirror where the fragile fight for life continued. The shepherd lay stretched on the back seat, her chest rising shallow and uneven, her eyes half closed but still tethered to the world. Pressed tightly against her, the pup never relented, its small body curled against her ribs, its nose nudging her muzzle, its whines constant like a chant of defiance against the silence of death. Every glance Mark stole at the mirror told the same story. The shepherd clung to breath, not alone but anchored by the steady warmth of her child. He pressed harder on the accelerator, the cruiser jolting as gravel turned to asphalt, the glowing red sign of the veterinary hospital appearing faintly on the horizon like a lighthouse guiding sailors to shore. He swung into the lot, brakes screeching, the vehicle jolting to a halt beneath the cold fluorescence of the emergency entrance. Before the dust had settled, Mark was already out of the driver's seat, arms scooping the shepherd's limp body as though it weighed nothing. The pup leapt from the back seat, hitting the pavement with a thud, then scrambled after him with desperate speed, nails clicking against the concrete. The sliding doors opened on a rush of sterile light, and staff hurried toward them at the sight of the dog in his arms. Critical Mark barked, voice low but firm. "She's not breathing right." They transferred her quickly onto a gurney, hands practiced motions efficient. The pup jumped at the edge, trying to climb up, barking wildly, refusing to let her slip away from its sight. A nurse scooped the little one gently and set it in Mark's arms as they rushed the shepherd through swinging doors. Mark stood there, chest heaving, the pup trembling in his hands. The waiting room felt unbearably still, fluorescent lights humming overhead, every tick of the wall clock loud enough to echo. He lowered himself into a hard plastic chair, the pup climbing into his lap, pressing its small frame against him for warmth. He stroked its back absently, his eyes fixed on the double doors, the weight of uncertainty pressing into him heavier than any duty shift. Minutes stretched like hours. He thought of every decision he had made that night, the moment he could have walked away, the moment he could have radioed it in and let someone else handle it, and shuddered at how close he had come to abandoning them to silence. The doors finally opened, and a man in a white coat stepped through, removing his gloves, his face calm but serious. Mark stood instantly, the pup balanced in his arms, its eyes locked on the doctor as if it too awaited judgment. "She's alive," the doctor said. "Measured but warm, but she's weak. It's remarkable she lasted this long." Relief hit Mark like a wave, his knees nearly giving way as he exhaled for the first time since he entered the building. The pup barked once, sharp and insistent, its tail wagging furiously as if it understood the shift in air. Mark's throat tightened. How he asked hoarsely. She looked like she was already gone out there. The doctor softened, glancing at the pup in Mark's arms. "She survived because of him," he said simply. The puppy's body heat kept her alive. He must have stayed pressed against her for days, keeping her warm, keeping her tethered. Without him, she would not have made it through. Mark looked down at the pup, stunned, seeing for the first time the full truth behind its determination. It had not only led him to her, it had carried her this far with loyalty and will far larger than its frame. His chest burned, his eyes stinging as the realization unfolded. The pup had not chosen just anyone. It had chosen him, the man it trusted, to finish what it could not. That trust, pure and unshakable, pressed into him with a force he had not expected. He whispered softly, "You knew I'd come." The pup licked his chin as if sealing the truth. The doctor guided him to the recovery room where the shepherd now lay swaddled in blankets, her chest rising in a steadier rhythm, machines softly monitoring her heartbeat. The pup wriggled from Mark's arms and bounded to her side, curling tightly against her once more, sighing as though the fight was finally shared instead of carried alone. Mark sat in the chair beside them, his large hands resting on his knees, his heart quieting for the first time all night. He felt the shift within himself, a realization as heavy as it was freeing. The smallest voice had led him here, and in following it, he had found more than a rescue. He had found family. The night outside still pressed dark against the glass, but in the sterile glow of the room, Mark felt a warmth he hadn't known in years. He reached forward, brushing a hand over the shepherd's head gently, whispering, "You're safe now, both of you." The pup looked up at him briefly, then nestled closer to her, as though confirming the bond had already been sealed. Mark leaned back, eyes closing for a moment, the weight of exhaustion finally giving way to something lighter. He had not only carried them from the forest, they had carried him out of loneliness. He had not admitted out of silence. He had accepted as permanent. As he opened his eyes again, he caught the reflection of the three of them in the window, a weary officer, a fragile mother, and a pup whose loyalty had refused to let go. It was not chance that brought them together. It was choice, pure and deliberate, made by a creature who had seen something in him worth trusting. And Mark, humbled and grateful, accepted it. This story shows us how even the smallest voice can lead to the greatest miracle. What moment touched you the most? The puppy refusing food, or the mother's final struggle to protect her child? Share your opinion in the comments below, and let us know your city or country too. Make sure you hit like and subscribe so you never miss another story.